On with tonight's talk. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Alison Searle and Emily Vine from Leeds University for a presentation of their AHRC-funded project, Pastoral Care, Literary Cure and Religious Dissent. The project is a partnership with the United Society Partners in the Gospel and the Methodist Homes Association. Now, you've read their biographies, Alison's and Emily's biographies, in our event publicity, so I'm not going to repeat that information, but I would like to stress that Alison is the co-general editor of the complete correspondence of Richard Baxter, which is forthcoming in 9 volumes with Oxford University Press. And she has also contributed 1 volume to the Oxford Complete Works of James Shirley in 10 volumes, also with OUP. Emily, that's another thing that I would like to add. Emily has recently published an article with the online journal IREA. And that online journal, you can see here, was a special issue co-edited by Anne Tessa Whitehouse and myself. And as you can see, we had a series of articles on the theme of lived religion. And here is the table of contents for a very brief glance. And here you can see Emily's work on charity work and care with Caroline Bodins just below. Okay, now before they begin their talk, Alison and Emily have asked me to point out that they are going to speak in 2 weeks' time exactly on the occasion of Bray Day. And again, perhaps the best way of telling you about Bray Day is by showing you here the advert that is on the website of the School of English at Leeds. They will be talking about past and present pastoral care across space and time in the company of Dr. Joe Sadgrove and Bishop Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I would just like to invite you, if you wouldn't mind, I would just like to invite you to now switch off your cameras as well as your microphones so that we can all focus on the speakers and on their presentations. When you do have a question, please feel free to enter it in the chat as we go along. I will try and monitor that and gather the questions together at the end so that Alison and Emily can address them during our Q&A session afterwards, during which, of course, we will be able to switch our cameras back on. Thank you very much. And now over to Alison and Emily.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for that very kind introduction. I will now see if I can get the PowerPoint working on the screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Brilliant. Just bear with me and I'll make it full screen. I can, no. There we go.
Yep.
So the seminar organisers have very kindly invited us to give an overview of our project on pastoral care. And this means that our presentation will differ in several ways from a standard academic paper. The project was designed as an intellectual and practical collaboration between academic and non-academic partners, which involved cross-cultural and trans-historical dialogue about practices of pastoral care in Protestant communities. We will discuss the historical components of the project, but we will also focus on the implications of this cross-sectoral partnership for how we have structured the project activities and public engagement, and what it means for our methodological approach as we move between disciplines, sectors, and audience groups. This is very much work in progress, so we are opening up aspects of our practice, as it were, as it's developed, rather than presenting a definitive set of research findings this afternoon. We would also like to provide a short content warning. One of our case studies focuses on the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and SPG missionaries encountered enslaved peoples in the colonies and the Caribbean, and from 1711, the Society itself became a slave-owning organisation, following the bequest of a plantation in the will of Christopher Codrington. A couple of the historical records we will refer to today include offensive language and references to the mistreatment of enslaved people. So I'd just like to start by giving a sense of what we're going to cover in our talk today. First of all, I'm going to give an overview of the initial project goals and how these intersect with the pandemic as it's developed. Secondly, a short introduction to the 3 historical case studies of correspondence that underlie the research. Thirdly, a reflection on what it means to provide pastoral care specifically through letters. And then Emily will pick up and talk about our partnership with Early Modern Letters Online, focusing particularly on aspects of metadata and the online exhibition which we're producing, which will be launched on the 15th of February at Bray Day, as mentioned earlier. And then she will talk a bit about our partnership with the United Society Partners in the Gospel, formerly SPG, particularly as it intersects with the Codrington bequest and the movement of Black Lives Matter as it's emerged over the last year as well. And then finally, we'll touch base on COVID-19 and our partnership with Methodist Homes, which is the largest charity care provider of aged care in the United Kingdom, and the role of faith actors in public health spaces. So you can see we've got quite a lot to try and cover in the period here, but we're hoping by giving this sort of more general overview and access to different aspects of the project and the kind of funding that underwrites this research, that it will help open up issues of interest to everyone who's here today. So starting with the initial aims of the project as it began in February last year, we were thinking about how public health has come to give increasing attention to forms of well-being and caregiving, and the ways in which caregiving has emerged as both as a formulation and a social practice. And the particular context we wanted to focus on were 3 communities of faith operating across the British Atlantic between 1630 and 1720, and thinking about how practices of care in the pre-modern past can inform and shape pastoral care and holistic well-being in our post-secular present. However, in March, we could never have envisaged just how topical, political, and critical practices of caregiving in the post-secular present would become as the global pandemic unfolded. So the project focuses on faith communities, and it was designed to assess how these communities and their practices of care were shaped by political exclusion and or geographical distance from centres of power in the early modern period. And such pressures required communities to exercise initiative by reinventing practices of ministry and generating new ways of providing pastoral care. I'm not going to read through the full original project outline. I've got it up on the screen for reference, and we can come back to it if people are interested later. But national borders, global travel logistics, and the treatment of vulnerable minorities in a nascent capitalist context, with the implications of such pressures for experimentation in pastoral caregiving and praxis, shaped this historical frame as initially envisaged. The contemporary resonances in relation to COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the fragility of a welfare state supported by faith-based organisations such as USPG and Methodist Homes, operating in a volunteer or charitable sector, has become relevant in a way that we did not expect at the start of this project, where austerity in the UK was a more prominent aspect of how we initially framed the project goals. Excavating pastoral care from the archives. So the archives preserved by the 3 communities at the heart of the project allow us to think through the concept of pastoral care, the vocabularies of pastoral care, emotion, and experience, particularly as exemplified and recorded in letters, and the role of the pastor as a physician of soul and body. And the question about responsibility for end-of-life care and the professional qualifications possessed by those who provide it has also been pressingly brought to the fore in the last 12 months. We've engaged in research with chaplains in aged care homes experiencing high death rates, and with parish priests in the Church of England facing unprecedented levels of inquiry, both for material support from their immediate local community, but also for spiritual support from a society confronted with death, insecurity, and a lack of control at a level unprecedented for many, at least, in 21st century Britain. And nurses and doctors, for example, are often the last and only person at the bedside of a COVID patient in hospital or in an aged care environment, and have to act as surrogates for family members forbidden from visiting. And this question of professional demarcation of responsibility for physical or spiritual health care was very much part of the pastoral care and ministerial and professional responsibilities of actors that we were looking at in the early modern period as well. The project is rooted in, but extends beyond an historical analysis of how liminal communities exercised care historically. And we consider how an historically and theologically informed concept of pastoral care can shape thinking about spirituality in our own evidence-based and instrumentalized public health context. We evaluate how the practices of care embodied by the historical communities we're researching speak to current thinking about the provision of aid and the role of faith actors in the global public sphere. So this contemporary strand of the project is ongoing, and we'll pick up some aspects of it in detail a bit later, but I'll turn now to the early modern component. We have 3 historical case studies of community archives of correspondence at the heart of the project, and the one that's proven to be most critical in shaping how we formulate and reflect on the relationship between practices of pastoral care in the present and the past is that of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel has an enormous archive, as some of you will know, documenting its long history and operations as an incorporated company involved in global mission. When it was established in 1701, the only viable form of technology available to facilitate communication between the Society's headquarters in London and the various missionaries it employed in the Caribbean and North America was handwritten letters. Our project examines letters from the first 20 years of the Society's existence, focusing on what they reveal about its early practices, the ways in which caregiving and oversight were established and administered remotely, and the diverse experiences of early missionaries in a range of contexts who both sought to provide care to potential, sometimes conflicting congregants, British immigrants, enslaved Africans, Indigenous people groups of the Americas, and to receive care from the Society, local patrons of various kinds, and fellow missionaries. Pastoral care, what it involves, and who should administer it to whom remains integral to the global operations of the United Society Partners in the Gospel in 2021. In the wake of COVID-19, practices of remote caregiving, how they are administered to vulnerable and precarious communities, and the ways in which those providing care are themselves resourced and sustained have become unexpectedly pressing. Using pastoral care as a lens, our research sets up a dialogue between USPG as an organisation operating in the present and its archive, reflecting on how SPG's initial formation as an Anglican mission organisation, partly resourced by the financial proceeds of enslaved labour on Caribbean plantations, and operating in liminal zones of experimentation and complex entanglements beyond the boundaries of the English nation state, intersects with, shapes, and informs its current institutional praxis and caregiving as a global partner within the International Anglican Communion. The second case study is the correspondence of Richard Baxter, a Puritan, later nonconformist minister famous for his pastoral skills. His many books, about 130 or so, and his letters. Through over 1,260 extant letters, ranging between 1638 and 1696, we can trace his remarkable life and career. We also have a rare documentary insight into nearly 6 decades of English cultural life. Baxter's Correspondence covers some of the most crucial decades of British cultural and constitutional history, including Charles I, the Civil War, the Commonwealth, the Cromwellian Protectorate, and the reigns of Charles II and James II. These were also years in which, as the letters bear witness, trade, global commerce, and travel flourished, alongside key advancements in science and the chartered success of the Royal Society. And in addition to his central role in his nation's struggles over its religio-political identity, Baxter's letters also show him to be connected to key players in all these intellectual spheres. He is chiefly known now for his pastoral ministry and non-conformity, but his letters offer authentic and often startling insights into complex and richly diverse lives that provide a critical data set for reflecting on pastoral care within the broad and wide-ranging intellectual, philosophical, and scientific reach of transatlantic Protestant cultures in the 17th century. The third case study focuses on the covenanting networks and correspondence of the radical Scottish Presbyterian Samuel Rutherford. Rutherford's resolute commitment to Presbyterianism put him at odds with the state church under Archbishop William Laud, and in 1636 he was removed from his beloved parish in Anworth and exiled to Aberdeen for non-conformity. Isolated from his parishioners and friends and forbidden to preach, Rutherford turned, like so many others, to letter writing as a way of encouraging, exhorting, and galvanizing his correspondents in their pursuit of a personal relationship with Jesus and in support of a covenanted Scottish kirk that refused to compromise with the episcopal establishment. His letters, the vast majority of his letters, can be dated to his period of exile in Aberdeen, and they circulated in copybooks and manuscripts during his lifetime. But it's their posthumous publication by his secretary, Robert MacWard, in the early 1660s that led to their establishment as a devotional and literary classic. And these letters demonstrate powerfully how a rhetoric of pastoral care, dispensed remotely, played a crucial role in shaping oppositional personal and political religious identities and the emotional communities that nourished and sustained them. The reach of the project is ambitious, perhaps too much so, but it has facilitated some rich interdisciplinary conversations that have been energized, inflected, and shaped in crucial ways by the contemporary public health crisis and the critical need for holistic care provision at so many levels in our own societies. This poses challenges and opportunities for our methodological approach, which we are still evaluating. It was very important to us as early modern researchers that our area of specialization and interest remained central in the formulation of the work, i.e. that engaging in wider partnerships and conversations did not dilute the importance of literary analysis and historical contextualization, but rather that they energized the work and helped to ensure its intellectual coherence. And here, our partnership with Early Modern Letters Online, based in Oxford, and particularly with the digital editor, Miranda Lewis, has played a central role, ensuring that the collection of historical data sets and analysis of correspondence items in our 3 case studies continues to underlie the project as it develops, and Emily will speak in more detail about that soon. I want to move now to what it means to provide pastoral care through letters as we're considering it across these 3 case studies. The pastor was understood to be a physician of body and soul, and the relationship between religion and healing was vexed in the 17th century. Though the professional identities of ministers and doctors were becoming more distinct, a pastor could find himself dealing with issues that troubled the boundary between religion and medicine, as, for example, when a parishioner was assessing the relationship between sickness and the concept of divine punishment. Tensions in how truth, knowledge, and expertise were combined in the clerical provision of pastoral care outside the confines of the church was a political issue as well. Private secular enterprises like the East India Company employed hundreds of chaplains. Their pay package often consisted in part of shares in the company, And by tending to the moral character of the company's employees, Sarah Haslam has argued, they were understood to be critical to ensuring its success, together with that of the empire as a political, commercial, and spiritual enterprise. Religious nonconformity created zones of experimentation in 17th century Britain that problematized easy distinctions between the sacred and secular and their relationship to the public sphere. Various forms of incarceration, such as prison, exile, and house arrest, required nonconformist clergy to fashion alternative methods of communication and strategies of pastoral care that differed from the usual practices of the state church. And indeed, we would argue a similar sort of scenario played out for missionaries moving to the fringes of proto-imperial spaces in North America and the Caribbean in the early 18th century with SPG. But though methods of communication were limited in the early modern period, the capacity of paper to travel played a crucial role in shaping politics, overseas expansion, and globalization. And the key genre here, though not the only one, was the letter. As a unique kind of artifact, at once material, textual, and political, it sits uneasily between personal and public spaces. Though it was relatively simple to transport, becoming more complex as we move across the Atlantic, even conceal, a letter could also betray those who had risked materially inscribing their thoughts. However, fear of incrimination did not prevent nonconformist ministers from writing letters, though it means the documents that survive are inevitably self-censored in ways that can no longer be fully reconstructed. Rutherford had to resort to letters confiding to one correspondent, "My dumb Sabbaths stick in my throat." Rutherford used letters to provide pastoral care to his congregation following his internal exile to Aberdeen in September 1636, and he develops a rhetoric of pastoral care through the process of writing letters. To label this more specifically as a Presbyterian rhetoric of pastoral care includes, I think, important similarities that demonstrate how his letters sit within the early modern European and transatlantic Republic of Letters, where both rhetoric and medicine shared significant affinities and shaped how clerics and medics dispensed epistolary counsel designed to cure. Rutherford's idiom may be idiosyncratic and belong to a recognizable linguistic subculture that was identified often in satirical or critical terms by contemporaries as Presbyterian. However, what he's doing through these letters is an outworking of practical divinity, or in other words, the practice of pastoral care, and the affinities between his attempts to enact epistolary cure and the letters of his contemporaries, not only amongst Puritans, but more broadly across the nonconformist divide, become clear, I think, as we look at his letters alongside the other correspondence data sets in our project. Examining what it means to perform pastoral care through letters entails considering pastoral care as a specifically textual phenomenon or as a form of literary care. Such textual fellowship also needs to be recognized as a relationship between writers. And the relationality of persons within the Trinity offered early modern pastors a theological resource when they were reflecting on care in dialogical forms. And this theological dimension foregrounds the importance of mutuality or dialogue in pastoral care. With Baxter's correspondence, unlike Rutherford's, both sides of the epistolary exchange are often preserved, and this enables the mutual caregiving between pastor and congregant or correspondent to be traced in detail. However, it's not necessarily all positive and constructive and reassuring. And as Michel Foucault has made clear, certain attributes of the Christian pastorate also apply to epistolary rhetorics of pastoral care. The technique of, and I'm quoting here, at once power, investigation, self-examination, and the examination of others, by which a certain inner truth of the hidden soul becomes the element through which the pastor's power is exercised, by which obedience is practiced. And I think it's important to emphasize the unequal hierarchies of power inherent to the exchange and receipt of pastoral care through letters, with important affordances for remote caregiving that can be positive and reassuring and comforting, but also with the potential for exploitation. And both of these can be mapped in detail across the 3 case studies of correspondence examined in our project. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks very much, Alison. I'm now going to talk about early modern letters online, which is a resource that many of you may be familiar with. But if you are not, it's very useful for lots of early modern related projects, and you should definitely have a look at their website. So Early Modern Letters Online is an open access union catalogue, acting as a gateway and calendar to global correspondence from the early modern period. Our project deals with 3 correspondence case studies, those which Alison has already talked about, Richard Baxter, Samuel Rutherford, and SPG. The partnership with EMLO was key from the project's inception. It enables the new research we are doing to enrich existing digital scholarly infrastructure, and it situates the letters we are examining within wider networks from the period, whether religious, scientific, literary, medical, or something else. As such, EMLO is integral to part of the project's methodology, particularly as we reflect on the function of letters as a communication technology and the power relationships, hierarchies, and entanglements they formed and perpetuated across the British Atlantic in the 17th and early 18th centuries. At the heart of EMLO lies research concerned with the Republic of Letters, the umbrella term used to denote the huge increase in the exchange of correspondence that took place between approximately 1550 and 1750. The large-scale exchange of letters and knowledge between those with similar scholarly interests created imagined communities made up of those separated by distance, but connected by epistolary networks. In particular, the Cultures of Knowledge project based at the University of Oxford and the Mapping the Republic of Letters project based at Stanford have focused on reconstructing these overlapping correspondence networks. Our partnership with EMLO has allowed us to develop new approaches to our own correspondence case studies and to position them as part of a broader transatlantic Republic of Letters. The Union Catalogue that forms EMLO contains the metadata for thousands of early modern letters. Since its launch, dozens of projects have collaborated with EMLO to contribute key information about the letters they've been working with. EMLO links these different research projects and letter collections together. This means that you can search the whole EMLO database, which currently contains 163,000 letters, and potentially make new links between different letter collections, different recipients, and different letter writers. So to explain what has taken up most of our day-to-day work on this project, I want to briefly talk about letter metadata. Letter metadata refers to basic categories of information associated with a given letter. These categories of information include the date that a letter was written, who wrote it, who the recipient was, where it was sent from, and where it was sent to. So for each of our 3 letter collections that we've been working with, we've been extracting and recording the metadata associated with each letter. We enter this information into either an Excel spreadsheet or a web form, and this information is then integrated into the EMLO Union Catalogue. So why is letter metadata so important? Well, you can find out some key information about a letter before you even start reading the main body of its text, such as who was writing to who and where letters were generally being sent to and from. Once you've extracted metadata from each letter in a collection, you can then run an analysis of a whole collection of letters. In our case study, once we've recorded the origin location of our sample of letters from the SPG corpus, we could then analyse the percentage of letters that were sent to South Carolina, for example. By looking at the date of different letters in our sample, we can analyse how many letters were sent in 1705 as opposed to 1710, and consider how this number has changed. By looking at the names and identities of letter writers, we can calculate the percentage of letters that were written by women. These are just a few examples of the different ways in which recording letter metadata can allow us to ask different questions and draw new conclusions. And once you add this metadata to the EMLO Union Catalogue, you can do even more things with it. By searching the database, you can make links between the SPG corpus and the letter metadata of all the other letter records in EMLO. You might find that an individual who appears frequently within the SPG letters also turns up writing to other people in quite different circumstances. And by using this Union Catalogue, you can learn new things about the networks and circles that these individuals moved in. This is particularly true of many of the prominent actors within the SPG, who often held positions of influence within the church, politics, law, or medicine. Many SPG committee members were also part of other church or learned societies, such as the SPG's first secretary, John Chamberlain, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, and SPG founder Thomas Bray, who also founded the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. The SPG Correspondence network accordingly intersects and overlaps with the broader business networks of London elites. We find that the key letter writers within SPG already appear in EMLO, writing letters to other men who held church or political office, or to the secretaries of other learned societies. And when we look at the locations and frequency of the SPG committee meetings, we find that many committee members sat on other committees and had alternative business with a range of individuals who already appear in EMLO. Contributing this metadata to a union catalogue like EMLO permits other researchers to trace these interactions, adding to our existing knowledge about these early 18th century social networks. And it was this extraction of metadata from our free letter collections and uploading the metadata from hundreds of letters onto EMLO that has been one of the key outputs from our project. Making the metadata from these letter collections available in an open access format ensures that other researchers can search and make use of this information and will be able to engage with it and add to it in the future. The specifically religious focus of our free data sets also means that by adding approximately 1,700 letters into EMLO, we are also helping to ensure that the critical role played by religious actors and correspondence are incorporated alongside the more typical candidates for the Republic of Letters, for example, John Locke or Pierre Bayle. As part of our collaboration with EMLO, we've also put together an online exhibition using the software platform Omica. This exhibition focuses on the work of the SPG in the 20 years after it was founded in 1701, making available photographs of some of the key manuscripts from its archive, alongside our transcriptions of these manuscripts. This makes this material available to a wider audience who wouldn't normally know about or have access to these manuscripts, or wouldn't be able to visit an archive, for example. We've curated this online exhibition around the theme of pastoral care, focusing on SPG missionaries' provision of pastoral care and the way in which the Society provided care for the missionaries themselves. We've made an active choice to structure this online exhibition in such a way as to counteract some of the traditional histories of the SPG and similar mission organisations. These histories, largely written in the mid-20th century, have focused on the predominantly elite white men who occupied the upper echelons of the society. In our approach, we wanted to highlight the important influence of women within the society, and also to address the complex interactions between the society and the indigenous people groups of the Americas, as well as with enslaved Africans. One of the central collections of the online exhibition seeks to highlight the important role of women, and particularly the wives of missionaries within the SPG. We seek to foreground the different ways that women had agency and influence over the SPG's work. We found examples of letters where candidates for the missionary write to the society to inform them that they can no longer travel to the American colonies because their wives have not given them permission to go. In other letters, debates take place about whether a certain parish is a suitable place for a married man to be sent, and occasionally clergy express concern about whether the transatlantic journey or climate will be safe for their wives and families. We also see the duty of care that the SPG has towards not only missionaries but their wives and families. There are several examples of financial support given to the widows of missionaries who died in the employment of the society. When a schoolmaster named Ross is taken prisoner on his way to his new posting in Chester, New York in 1711, the secretary instructs a nearby SPG missionary to comfort his wife and family. One of the most interesting case studies that we highlight in our exhibition is the case of Mary Keefe, who writes several letters to the Society and to the Archbishop of Canterbury. In her letters, we see her circumnavigating her husband and appealing directly to the Society, both for financial aid and in an attempt to prevent her husband being sent abroad in the first place. In 1708, she writes to the Society to express her hope that they do not restore her husband's allowance because she does not want him to go to America. She then acknowledges that her husband is very desirous to make the journey and begs that the Society will not tell him that she had written to them. In a second undated letter, it appears that Mary Keefe's petition was not successful. Her husband is in America, and Mary and their children have remained in London and are running out of money. She writes to the Society to beg that they advance some of her husband's salary and provide them with another form of financial assistance. If they do not do this, they must send her husband home to London so that he could provide for his family. Mary warns the Society, "If I get not present relief, we will be immediately thrown to the street, and my children perish for want of bread." We see here that Mary is a literate woman who is well versed in the language and protocol of petitioning. Although women have been frequently overlooked within organisational histories of corporations like the SPG, we see here that Mary has a clear understanding of how the Society works and what it owes to her, and a degree of agency to exert pressure upon them. In this exhibition, we also use the lens of pastoral care to consider SPG missionaries' encounters with non-white and non-Christian populations. SPG missionaries were duty-bound to provide pastoral care to the white European members of their often newly established congregations, but did they consider enslaved Africans or Indigenous Americans to be parishioners? And by extension, did they consider these people to be the objects of their care? A key case study that we highlight in the exhibition are the letters and work of Francis Lejow, a missionary who was based in Goose Creek in South Carolina. Throughout his years in South Carolina, Lejow wrote detailed letters to London in which he recorded his observations of the cruel and unhumane manner in which enslaved people were treated by several masters in the area in and around his parish. Yet within the very same series of letters in which Lejow denounced the cruelty he had observed in neighbouring slave owners, he informed the Society of a fact that would appear to undermine his pretences to hold a duty of care towards enslaved people within his parish. He lamented that his parishioners did not help him maintain his household, and he did not have a maid. So accordingly, this work was undertaken by 3 slaves, which I have been forced to purchase by degrees new and raw, according to Lejow. In this one sentence, Lejow reveals himself to be a slave owner and highlights the complex ways in which he viewed enslaved people. He considers them to be his parishioners and to be objects of his spiritual care, while also seeing their enslaved labour as essential to his own material survival and well-being. We also see Lejow's complex interactions with Indigenous American people. His letters show the proto-imperialist designs underpinning his attempts to convert Indigenous Americans to Christianity. He frequently discusses his attempts to translate the Lord's Prayer into the Savannah language, which he believes is a language that can be understood over the whole American continent. In some letters he writes of, in his view, his attempts to act benevolently towards Indigenous Americans. He writes, "I have tried to get some free Indians to live with me and would clothe them, but they will not consent to it, nor part with their children, though they lead miserable, poor lives." Elsewhere, we see that Lejao is reliant on his Indigenous American neighbours for help and sustenance. The corn that they grow is a staple food for his household. And throughout his letters, he writes repeatedly of his fascination with Indigenous American languages, his desire to learn them, to translate Christian texts into these languages, and to send writing samples back to London so that the Society's headquarters could learn more about them. Through these examples, we see the complex entanglement of caregiving relationships. Lejao views converting Indigenous Americans and providing them with clothing and the offer of sharing his house to be a benevolent act of care. Missionary work, regardless of intentions, can never be a solely benevolent act, and all of Lejao's interactions are underpinned by unequal power dynamics and proto-imperialism. Yet by the same token, Lejao is reliant on Indigenous Americans to help him, to provide him with food sources and learn how to live in a climate that he considers hostile. These complex entanglements of caregiving relationships, and particularly the power dynamics of caregiving between different types of people, is something we have tried to foreground in our online exhibition, which will be launched in a couple of weeks' time on the 15th of February. And now I'll hand briefly back to Alison.
Thanks, Emily. So we've spoken briefly about the ways in which our original research goals on practices of pastoral care have been reformulated in the context of the pandemic. And critical to this has been our intellectual and impact partnership with Dr. Jo Sadgrove, the Research and Learning Advisor at USPG. Jo's background is in ethnography, religion, and public health. And initially, we were going to use the HIV/AIDS crisis as a lens through which to reflect on the role of faith actors in the global humanitarian public sphere. But Jo suggested rethinking this strand and focusing on COVID-19 instead. And this has entailed not only reimagining the project from the ground up, but also in dialogue with something we were concurrently experiencing, inviting a measure of autoethnography, which has been a unique, daunting, and rewarding learning curve for both Emily and I as early modern researchers. Effectively, in dialogue with Jo, we turned a multi-day symposium on public health into two separate strands of activity, a series of webinars with USPG and their global partners, and a research day with chaplains employed by Methodist Homes, MHA, the largest charity provider of aged care in the UK. And Emily will now unpack a bit of what those activities and partnerships have looked like.
Yes, so we've briefly discussed how SPG missionaries encountered enslaved Africans in the American colonies. Several SPG missionaries, such as Francis Lejao, who we've mentioned, may have been slave owners. But the Society's complicity in slavery goes to the heart of its identity and practice as an organisation. In 1711, the Society was left a bequest of a plantation in Barbados, along with 300 enslaved Africans, in the will of Christopher Codrington. We've put the key extract from his will up on this slide, but the bequest says, "Item, I give and bequeath my 2 plantations in the island of Barbados to the Society for Propagation of the Christian Religion in Foreign Parts." Codrington wishes that the plantations be kept entire, along with the 300 enslaved Africans forced to work upon the land, and for a convenient number of professors and scholars to be maintained there. Codrington left this plantation to the Society with the design that they establish a school to teach medicine and divinity, and that the plantation be used to finance both this school and the wider work of the society. The plantation is established as a means of materially resourcing the SPG's mission work, or, as it is phrased here in the will, of doing good to men's souls. We have the same complex and conflicted entanglement of material resource and spiritual care that is evident in Le Zhao's own correspondence, but evidenced here at a corporate level. Not only did the SPG accept Codrington's bequest, it continued to operate the plantation and profit from the labour of enslaved people for over 100 years. University College London's Legacies of British Slavery project has shown that as of 1836, the SPG owned 410 enslaved people and received compensation of £8,500 after abolition. As we were beginning to engage in this aspect of the history of the SPG, the most recent Black Lives Matter movement was underway. When the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was toppled into Bristol Harbour in June 2020, we became aware that Colston had been a member of SPG. While we had already been mindful of the complex connection between the SPG's active role in the slave trade and its provision of pastoral care, this contemporary dimension has energised and politicised what we're doing in unexpected ways. Slavery and pastoral care are entangled in the early history of the SPG on multiple levels. On one level is the question of who is the object of the SPG's pastoral care. Were enslaved people considered parishioners? On another is how we unpick attempts by SPG missionaries to educate, convert, and baptize enslaved Africans into the Christian faith. This is something that Travis Glasson and Catherine Gerbner have written excellent books on, but broadly speaking, SPG missionaries were keen to baptize enslaved people, but slave owners were concerned that baptism would make their slaves technically free. The SPG responded to this by reassuring them that baptism did not equal freedom, and indeed that enslaved people that had been educated in the Christian faith would be more productive. And at the heart of it all is the fact that the rest of the SPG's mission work and pastoral care provision was underwritten and financially resourced by enslaved labour on the Codrington plantation. It was the profits from the Codrington plantation that allowed the SPG to expand its mission in the way that it did. As you will have seen from the quote from Christopher Codrington's will, the fact that the mission and pastoral care work of the society, its intention to do good to men's souls, was directly underwritten by plantation labour, has made our focus on pastoral care unexpectedly vital. The recent reappraisal of the legacies of individuals such as Edward Colston and Christopher Codrington has encouraged us to foreground the relationship between slavery and pastoral care within our project, and to make this a key part of our public-facing online exhibition. The other key and unexpected event that has refocused our research project in the last 12 months has of course been the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially, this has had practical implications for our research, meaning that, like many other archive-based projects, we could no longer travel to archives to view our manuscript material. But it also intersected in profound and unexpected ways within our analysis of pastoral care, past and present. The partnership work and contemporary angle of our research deals with questions of pastoral care in a post-secular environment. How do religious structures of care provision interact with state-provided care and public health provision? COVID-19 has allowed us, along with our project partners USPG and MHA, to continue to rethink the role of chaplaincy in times of crisis. Methodist Homes chaplains have been at the forefront of providing care during COVID-19. In the first wave, they were the only visitors who were permitted into aged care homes, being present with care home residents when family were not able to be there. In September, we participated in MHA's annual Research Day, which was designed to enable MHA chaplains to share their experiences of providing care during an unfolding crisis, to express concerns and ask questions, and as a means of processing what they were witnessing and developing resources of self-care alongside others working in similar environments. The chaplains who participated expressed a lot of anxiety about working in high-risk environments and lived with the daily fear and guilt of taking COVID-19 home with them and infecting those that they lived with. Such experiences of the dangers of providing care in times of crisis and the burdens placed on carers and their families have a long history, and there are opportunities to reflect upon and learn from these contexts. In places like South Carolina, we see SPG missionaries writing of high mortality and endemic sickness, probably owing to yellow fever, and expressing fear that the colonies would not be a safe place for their wives and families to travel to. We also see concerns about hostile climates, drought and famine, fears of piracy and war with the French, and general expressions of the grief and displacement of those who were several thousand miles away from home. In one of his numerous letters reporting on his mission work in South Carolina, Francis Lejow hints at the danger of the 10-week transatlantic crossing, rejoicing that they had had no bad accident and all our ship's company in health, before noting that only 3 men had died in the past 5 months. He then provides a warning for future clergy who travel to South Carolina. If the Society thinks fit to send any missionary to any one of our vacant parishes, and they should have families, if they be your friends, I must ingeniously declare they must prepare to suffer great hardships and crosses. It was in these circumstances that SPG clergy were tasked with serving and providing pastoral care to their parishioners. Reflecting on previous contexts of pastoral care provision in times of crisis can help resource caring for the carers. In our conversations with MHA chaplains, we discussed the importance of care home chaplains as key workers, the fact that chaplaincy is a vital form of care work, and the need for peer support and the resourcing of care for the carers. Care home chaplains are in need of a space to debrief about the experiences that they've witnessed, of having opportunities to share with those who have experienced similarly traumatic working environments. Webinars and virtual support groups provide an opportunity to unload and process some of their experiences. During COVID-19, video calling and platforms such as Zoom have increasingly been used as a means of facilitating this remote provision of care, but also as a means of supporting the care providers. In the early 18th century, as we've suggested, remote caregiving was facilitated by letters. In our project, we've considered the longer historical context of providing care through words, letter writing, reading, or book provision. In a symposium on literary care that we organised in May 2020, several speakers spoke about the therapeutic nature of reading or bibliotherapy as a form of care. This has been apparent in a number of historical contexts, including 19th century asylums, and as a means of treating soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder in the First World War. In times of crisis, SPG missionaries in the colonies wrote to their society's London headquarters to appeal for guidance, often using the medium of letter writing to communicate and process the hardships they were facing. In turn, the Society provided practical and material support to its missionaries by sending them books and letters. The latter providing often isolated clergy with contact, guidance, and answers to their questions. The books, often religious texts, providing spiritual comfort and reinforcement of their mission work. In the same way that letters were an important way of providing care for SPG missionaries, online Zoom meetings and groups have been an invaluable support for chaplains, helping to actualise MHA's goal to care for the carers as well as care home residents. COVID-19 has also impacted our partnership work with USPG. In our consideration of the Church's role in pastoral care provision, past and present, Joe Sadgrove had intended to lead the contemporary aspects of the project with a consideration of the Church's care provision during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. However, Joe responded to COVID-19 by shifting the focus of this aspect of the research, and with USPG, co-organised a series of global webinars which focused on the Church and caregiving, and which were influenced by COVID-19. Both the medium and messaging of these webinars has been key to our consideration of remote caregiving. The webinar, rather than a face-to-face workshop format, has welcomed participants from around the world, and particularly from the Global South, rather than just those who can travel to Leeds or London. In one webinar, speaker Father Dwight De La Torre joined us from Hong Kong. In another, we were joined by the Reverend Canon Professor Gideon Bayamagisha, the first religious leader in Africa to go public about being HIV positive, who spoke to us from Uganda. This has allowed us to learn from global expertise, and the webinar format has, to a certain extent, de-centred these knowledge exchanges. This is highly significant for a mission organisation which by its very nature has been built on a history of unequal global exchanges. These webinars have focused on the Church's role in both care provision and public health messaging. Participants reflected on how the Church has learned from previous failures of public health messaging, such as during the early years of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, when little was done to counteract stigma, and some messaging was actively harmful. We also heard from Dr. Anne Richards, who is the National Advisor for Mission Theology for the Church of England. Part of her role since the COVID-19 pandemic began has involved being active on web forums and social media, interacting with those who are seeking answers to spiritual questions in response to COVID-19. Some of these are from people turning to the Church for the first time, who seek answers to questions such as, how should I pray? What should I say? But Anne also finds herself countering potentially harmful disinformation, responding to those who feel that COVID-19 is a punishment from God, fears of what is in the vaccine, and to those who plan on harming themselves in various ways in an attempt to prevent themselves from getting COVID-19. Webinars such as the ones we've arranged with our partners have emphasised how much the UK's COVID-19 response could learn from global expertise, and particularly expertise from the Global South, learned from previous epidemics such as Ebola and HIV/AIDS. It also emphasises the important role that the Church has in both care provision and responsible public health messaging. At the centre of all this is the vital importance of words as a means of providing care, the sending of letters and books as a means of providing comfort, argument as a means of countering harmful disinformation, discussions and support groups as a means of debriefing following traumatic working experiences, shared liturgies as a means of uniting believers, and effective communication as a means of reinforcing key public health messages. And I'll hand over to Alison now for some concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Emily. We realise that we've covered a lot here and that the different aspects will be of varying degrees of interest to different people who are involved. However, the key points that we'd like to flag and potentially open up for discussion are the way in which pastoral care, attention to the holistic needs of mind, soul and body, past and present, has been unexpectedly foregrounded by the current pandemic. And we've shaped our research aims and outputs in direct response to this. Thinking about the topic of this seminar series, the relevance of the study of lived religion in the 17th and early 18th centuries to questions of material resource, narrative construction and care provision today. And you'll have seen from Emily's unpacking of the two contemporary aspects of our research project that we're still reflecting on the methodological implications of moving between past and present in these spaces and what it means. And I think from my point of view, I'm more persuaded in some respects by the Black Lives Matter connections than I am by certain aspects of the COVID-19 connections. And that's something we're still reflecting on and thinking about as early modern researchers working on a transhistorical project of this kind. And finally, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter have profoundly shaped the ways in which we have practically conducted our research, with very limited access to archives or project meetings and engagement moved online, but also how we understand our identity and methodological approach as literary historical scholars of early modern archives in relation to contemporary issues of care and racial injustice, particularly as we're working actively in partnership with two faith-based organisations practically working in this contemporary space, such as MHA and USPG. And we were wondering if other researchers have found that their identity and praxis has changed as a result of the events of the last 12 months. And just to finish off with a picture of this seminar and the launch of the online exhibition, which was very kindly mentioned in the introduction as well. So I'll hand back to Laurence.
Hello again, and thank you both for a spectacular presentation of this monumental project. I had realized it covered, of course, many different areas and a vast chronological scope, but thanks to your very enlightening presentation, I have now come to realize really what it means, and that must be indeed a daunting endeavor for the people involved, but it's also absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for giving us that glimpse, that insight into this ongoing project, even though it is meeting with some challenges right now in terms of access to sources, etc. It really is fascinating to see how you have responded to the circumstances currently around you, and instead of dealing with that adversity as something that prevented you from moving forward, you actually used it to propel you in a different direction, which is really quite astonishing and resourceful. I will take, first of all, if you don't mind, some of the questions that have been put down in the chat. And because I think they echo what you finished with, I will perhaps in order begin with David Manning's and Sarah Watson's before moving on to Françoise de Koning-Brossard, if that's okay with you. David Manning notes that in the contemporary world, and I do think that echoes what you said very much at the beginning, both Emily and Alison, we've seen that our capacity to deliver effective and humane pastoral care seems to have perhaps eroded. And given that SPG pastoral care was set up within the culture of early modern projecting, the question is, does your project open up reflections about how we might reformulate 21st century approach not only to pastoral care, but also to the social, the funding of social care. So it's that spanning between the past and the present. And it's a two-part question, and I think the second part, in between brackets, is also very fascinating. Does instrumentalism within academia help or hinder our thinking here, in your opinion?
That's a challenging question to start with. And in some ways, I think we're still wrestling. When I said we're thinking through the methodological implications of rethinking our project processes in the light of the pandemic, that's part of it. And I have to say, working with an ethnographer in a mission organisation has been an interesting interdisciplinary experience in that space. I'm not sure that I can say that we have clear outcomes for reformulating a 21st century approach to how social care for the elderly should be funded as a result of the project. I think that would be something that needs more time, more reflection, and a much broader set of expertise than we currently have on the core research team. Though I do hope that some of the conversations we've started to have through research days with the director of chaplaincy at Methodist Homes and others, for example, might open up ways of thinking about that. The way I'd say it's playing out in relation to USPG is very much in thinking about, and this is an ongoing conversation that where I'd say we've been instrumental in helping that conversation to develop is by being academic outsiders, taking in trust as partners into a conversation or dialogue. It's galvanized particular internal conversations within USPG as a corporation that I think is helping to create the space for them to have those conversations and to actualize some of those changes in terms of global partnerships, in terms of reallocation of resource, and in terms of reflecting what it means for their work in partnership, not least how they tell the story of their past in the present. And that's part of what we've been trying to grapple with the online exhibition. In relation to the second part of the question, does instrumentalism within academia help or hinder our thinking here? That is something that I'm still wrestling with personally as a researcher in this space. The interesting thing about the AHRC Leadership Fellowship Scheme, which is the strand that funds the work that we've been doing, is its focus on impact-related work, on relationships between the university and wider publics. And so in some respects, you could say the instrumentalizing is an invitation to think more actively and in cross-sectoral terms. You could also say that it constrains in particular ways the kinds of questions you might ask. And in a sense, COVID has forced us to rethink it in a way that pushes us beyond perhaps the original ambition of the structure we had, which is why I went through those original project goals and tried to reflect on how they'd changed. Emily, I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, just to sort of add to what Alison's already summarised, I think both of us have approached this partnership very, very mindful of what, as early modern historians and literary scholars, we can contribute to these partnership relationships, and also what we're not going to attempt to do as well. This is the first time that I've been involved in this kind of partnership based research. Previously, I've done partnership research with museums, but working with an organisation like USPG or MHA is quite a different space. So I think in our research days with these organisations, we have, as Alison has said, offered those spaces for comparison with historical context when it's useful to do so. And spaces for conversation and dialogue to happen with us present. But we've also been very mindful to learn from the ethnographers we've been working with, for example, and the real experts in social care and contemporary humanitarian provision. But certainly, as Alison says, I think there's hopefully a lot of scope for people in these organisations to think, okay, well, we can partner with humanities researchers working in fields that we wouldn't automatically make links with, and fruitful things can come from these partnerships. So we hope that it might be offer some inspiration to others thinking about this form of partnership-based research.
Thank you very much for these elements of answer, which it is a very, very complex question, and I'm not surprised it is taking you some time to work out exactly how you can position yourselves within that field, because there is so much mixing and merging here, and much at stake as well. So I think this resonates with Sarah Watson's question also about how, and that's very intriguing, how you are planning to integrate your reflection on COVID-19 to your early modern work, or is it not something that's going to apply like that? Maybe it's not a question of integration, but rather of entering into conversation.
Thanks for that question, Sarah. I think, Laurence, you've already started to answer it. One of the opportunities that this project has given us is a space to have conversations that open up new ways of formulating questions, but also of helping practitioners in various spaces to rethink how they do some of the work that they do in relation to their own history, a sort of movement between institution and archive, if you like, in that sense. And so I think a lot of the work that we envisage happening as part of the movement between contemporary reflections on COVID and the early modern period is happening in those conversations, in those research days, in those spaces of encounter, engagement, and dialogue. In terms of how we're thinking of integrating it within the early modern work, I suppose the main way I gestured towards the fact that I think in methodological terms I've been more persuaded about the correlation between the implications of Black Lives Matter and the historical archive of USPG than I have in some respects between the COVID aspects. But I think that's also because the complexity of living through something and reflecting on it and then asking those questions and what they mean is very difficult to unpack in the process. And that's a new space. That's a new space for me as a researcher to be reflecting on process in practice, if I can put it in those terms, and also to reflect on what the past means when it's very livingly present in political and in practical terms for a contemporary organisation. And so I'd say that one of the key ways in which we will integrate some of the COVID aspects will actually be through the work that our partner Jo Sadgrove is doing, and she's producing a policy report that's thinking about the contemporary in dialogue with the historical in relation to USPG's work and also in relation to parish work through the Church of England, which is part of USPG's broader constituency in the present, as it were. I'm not sure that really answers the question. I think it's the kinds of questions we ask and how we ask them, perhaps, that's changed. That has changed for me. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, so again, just to echo that this has been a new way of doing research for me as well. And Alison and I have had several conversations where we've said, oh, but these webinars, this discussion, this is actually the research. It's not just sitting in the archive. It's not just working through the 18th century material, but it's having these conversations with different people and different organisations, which is helping generate ideas and rethink some of our own approaches to the material. And I think in terms of how we're sort of integrating COVID into our early modern research, I think it's also the awareness of the benefits you can get from different forms of comparison. I've seen an awful lot of attempts to make comparisons between early modern plague, for example, and COVID-19, to make comparisons between historical pandemics and what we're living through at the moment. But I think our project shows that there are different ways of making these forms of comparisons between quite different contexts, and that you can get fruitful things out of those discussions and comparisons. But I agree, it's an important question, and I think one we're continuing to think about, really. Thank you.
Yes, I was struck during your talk about, struck at the term autoethnography, and I wondered, as soon as you said it, when you explained how you shifted, I want to say, focus from the HIV/AIDS crisis to the current crisis, and this lens of autoethnography seems to me to be awfully challenging, but also potentially for you to define as well as you go along. And so it is challenging, but also very promising in a way, I suppose. I would like also to move, as I promised earlier on, to the question asked by Françoise de Conan-Brossard. And she asked, how does EMLO relate to the Electronic Enlightenment project?
The short answer is I don't know. I'm not sure if is it a separate Oxford project that is in some ways entangled with Voltaire's Correspondence? Am I thinking of the right project or not? I don't know, so I'll leave it at that. Emily, do you know any more about it?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'm not sure. Is it a specific project or a general reference to a term? Could we get any more clarification on that, perhaps?
Françoise, if you'd like maybe to, if you can, of course, switch on your microphone, you're welcome to do so.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'm wrong, but I had the idea that Electronic Enlightenment was a database of letters, published editions of letters. In some notes dating back to 2014 in my notebook, it said something that it included over 67,000 letters, but I assume that they were published letters rather than manuscript letters, but that is probably my own imagination.
I think EMLO it brings together a lot of projects that contain vast numbers of letters. So Electronic Enlightenment may well be a key part of EMLO, I think. The wonderful thing is the way they've brought together these different collections so that we can search between them.
It also does cover both printed and manuscript material, so a large proportion, I think I can't remember the exact number of Baxter's Correspondence, for example, survives in print rather than manuscript, and those letters will be incorporated. The Bodleian also has a card catalogue that has been incorporated in part into EMLO as well. So it's acting as a union catalogue that absorbs numerous projects, and in a sense that's its use, and that's why we wanted to contribute to the infrastructure, not least because the Republic of Letters is often not including in its digital representation a large amount of the specifically religious correspondence. And we were very keen to see, as Emily unpacked in her section of the talk, the way in which some of those other subsets of correspondence intersect with what's already there around more Enlightenment topics and the kind of idea of the intellectual Republic of Letters, or a scientific model that we're more familiar with.
Yes, and as we're talking about databases and large projects of that nature, one of our doctoral students, Lauriane Raymond, asks whether you think that or how do you think the EMLO project embodies the archival turn that has happened in recent years, the sort of digitization of manuscripts and the open access or not open access, depending on projects, etc.
That's another very big question. I'd say it represents some of the best examples of best practice in its focus on letters and how that works in terms of its open access nature and in terms of the way it provides a stable infrastructure based at the Bodleian to allow various projects to inject their data into a broader network of data, as it were, and open up archives of material. And that's one of the key reasons we chose to have this metadata element to the research project. However, I think the limitations are that it's dependent on what's injected into it. So it's only as representative as what goes into it in that sense. And therefore, like any digital humanities endeavor, it can't be comprehensive. There's a large number of archives that are the SPG archive is a case in point. Emily and I have worked on a small number of letters. It's an enormous archive, and part of what we wanted to do in incorporating that aspect into our work today and our presentation today was to encourage postgraduate students, if they're working on correspondence data sets, to consider even just injecting the basic metadata, so those 6 points that Emily mentioned about the letter, into it to make them findable, searchable, comparable for other researchers involved in that kind of work. I mean, the data sets mainly that Emily's been working with to inject into it. So we got permission from OUP and from Neil Keeble to use a subset of material from the calendar of the Correspondence of Richard Baxter. So that now means there's a basic set of metadata about over 1,200 of Baxter's letters that's searchable within that archive. And it's simply a matter of taking that data set and integrating it into the system. We've done this, Emily is doing the same with Bonner's edition of Samuel Rutherford's letters. Now, we know that it needs archival updating and development, but injecting those 365 letters means that there's suddenly a network of Scottish Covenanters and various patrons and gentry and women who are working powerfully in that period too to extend the Presbyterian Covenanting movement. And that helps to open new horizons. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think there are real limits, but real opportunities as well.
And I think just to add, I feel what EMLO is doing is quite different to digitisation projects, for example. It's very, very different to, I think, of the Wellcome Library's digitised manuscript recipe books, for example, or early English books online. It's by focusing on the metadata of these letter collections, it's allowing researchers to do some really interesting analysis with just that information. So not reproducing whole letters, although there are whole letters on EMLO, but giving that basic information that allows us to go, okay, so John Smith wrote to John Chamberlain at this point, and he also wrote to this other person, to make connections between letter writing from different places across the world and at different times during the early modern period. So I think it's encouraging researchers to approach archival material with perhaps different questions. What can I do with the basic information related to these manuscripts? What interesting questions can I answer with this? So it's allowing researchers to do some really valuable work, I think.
Yeah, if I may, Emily, just on what you said here, and you taught us here, you showed us on your slides some of the key points of the metadata that you identify. And does every single letter have the answers to all these metadata categories? For instance, do you always have a date of writing, etc.? Because that's what I find with a lot of archives. Often these very important metadata are missing.
No, there's an awful lot of absences, as I'm sure anyone who's worked with letters will be aware of. EMLO itself, they've obviously been developing solutions to that over the years. So they ask us, for example, to make a note of when a date is not present, when a date is approximate, for example, when it's inferred, when a particular individual is given a nickname, for example, rather than their actual name is stated. So all these features about a letter are in themselves, I think, very interesting and very useful. The absences and the inferences are an important part of how we record the letter metadata. So in EMLO, there are opportunities to flag where either information isn't present or it's recorded differently, and we're making inferences from it.
Excellent, thank you. I think if we want to keep the flow of the conversation going, perhaps Caroline's question is well, it's not really a question, but more of a comment, is what comes more naturally right here. Caroline mentions that a key problem with electronic enlightenment is that it needs a subscription, and a hefty one, I believe, to use. And that will keep people out. So again, do you see open access as one of the stakes maybe of projects nowadays?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an absolutely critical aspect, and it's also impacting the way funding is developing, at least in the UK space as well, going forward in terms of how you configure the outputs of various projects. One of the reasons we were keen to be involved with EMLO from the start is it's building into an open access infrastructure that's thought very carefully and sustainably about how to define correspondence in particular, and it's available for free. But that doesn't mean it's free. And so in a sense, using public funding to invest further into the kind of established digital infrastructure seems to me a really important and necessary thing to be doing. And it's one of the joys of this project is that I've been working on an ad hoc basis with EMLO and with Miranda Lewis there for over 10 years now as we've been developing the Baxter Correspondence work. And it's just fabulous to actually start to be able to inject some funds back in and extend that work in various ways. And the USPG exhibition that we're producing that'll be launched in 2 weeks' time is also hosted by the EMLO space. So it's in the Bodleian EMLO space, and it will be another way, as it were, of drawing people in and thinking about and reflecting on the contents of the letters there.
Mm. Yes, I think you make a very important, crucial point to my mind. Availability for free does not mean it is free. And this is something that really is, I think, at the core of so many projects nowadays, but also public perception of what is available to them online. We have a question by Anne and Paige about the kind of pastoral that you see at work in the early modern correspondences. How can you identify specifically pastoral letters from other types of letters? Are the letters written to especially vulnerable people, subgroups, people suffering from melancholy or whatever? And how did ministers negotiate general advice and specific cases? Thank you, Anne, for your question.
That's a really important question, Anne, and it's one that we're wrestling with. You will have heard from our presentation today that there's an amorphous dimension to how we're trying to grapple with some of these questions and issues. And in a sense, I think it's opened up some things that will be starters and some things that will be no-goers. And I'm still reflecting on how that will work. And that's part of the nature of this kind of experimental dialogue, I think. In terms of the specifics of your question, in focusing on pastoral care and letters in the early modern period, there is an argument that all of the kinds of correspondence that we're looking at from the first 20 years of the SPG, for example, is pastoral simply by the nature of the fact that they're sending missionaries out into spaces that are very difficult to deal with. So they're not only personally experiencing difficulties, but there's a pastoral dimension of duty of care between the organisation and the people that they're sending out, as well as their families. So I think there's that element, if you want to think of it in pastoral terms of the church itself caring for the people it's sending out to care for other people. In terms of the two other data sets that we've been looking at, the two other correspondence case studies, with Rutherford, I would say most of the letters that have survived in the 365 letters we have in the print edition are fairly easy to categorize as pastoral in nature, because they're either dealing with cases of conscience, they're dealing with anxiety about particular things, or they're dealing with churches, they're pastoral letters to church groups, as it were, saying, stick to the faith, keep up the resistance work, or politically directed pastoral letters that are designed to shore up the covenanting cause in Scotland. So I would see I would personally see those. I mean, the elision between personal and pastoral and political is complex, but for Rutherford, he fuses them, and that's very much specific to his epistolary style. Baxter is, as usual, more complex than other people, and I'm still thinking about that, and I probably will continue to think about it. Emily, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one.
I'm likely to be more enlightening than Alison already has, but certainly with the Rutherford Letters, which we've spent a bit of time writing about recently. It's often very difficult to unpick a particular question that Rutherford is writing in response to. For example, often there are multiple questions that a letter writer has approached him with. So I think we're approaching pastoral letters in a very broad scope to capture all of the different forms of either spiritual consolation or advice that we find individuals like Rutherford and Baxter giving. So it's a broad definition, as Alison has said.
Thank you so much for really taking the time to answer our questions at length and so fully. It's very, very illuminating. In continuing on that same idea, but perhaps even delving more deeply into the way in which you deal with the material aspects of the letters, Alexandra Worsham asks if you could reflect a little more on the textuality of those pastoral letters or pastoral care in the project. How is the medium shaping the message in those letters? And how does this relate to the premium that godly Protestants placed on the spoken word, spoken and written here being perhaps not necessarily in opposition? What does all this reveal about shifting attitudes to print and publication in the 17th and 18th centuries? Alexander also wanted to mention an Oxford DPhil on epistolary consolation by Lucy Busfield, which you may know about already. Thank you, Alexandra, for this really interesting question.
I'm not sure I can answer all of that now properly, or indeed at this point properly, but thank you very much for the series of questions. I think we've thought quite a lot about the textuality of pastoral care as part of the project, and we've been thinking about that in terms of the way in which letters are often understood as a dialogue, but in actual fact, because of the way these letters are transmitted and communicated and the movement between corporations and individuals that are sometimes at stake, as well as obviously the fact that letters are read to a broader community of people than the initial recipient often, what does it mean? What does it mean to have something written down, and then in terms of exposure, but also in terms of interpretation and further reflection or engagement? I think one of the most interesting ones that we've looked at is the exchange of correspondence between Barbara and Thomas Lamb in the late 1650s with Richard Baxter, looking at movement from a broadly Baptistic idea of congregation and practice into a more mainstream, and then ultimately for the Lamb's Anglican movement back into the Anglican Church. And it's fascinating looking at the way in which they're reading each other's writing, they're incorporating that. Sometimes Barbara Lamb is acting as a spokesperson for her husband because he's too melancholy or not able to engage. So there's this movement between written text, book text, and published work and pastoral care and identity, congregational identity in that space. In terms of how the medium shapes a message, perhaps an interesting, and this taps into the print aspect as well. With Rutherford's correspondence, most of the letters only survive in print, and so they're one of the casualties of the project has been we haven't been able to get to the Scottish Archives to do some of the research that we wanted to do at the National Library at St Andrews University Library. So that's something we've had to park effectively. But we have been reflecting on what a printed collection of letters is doing in a distinctive way in the mid to later 17th century, and how Rutherford's letters in particular are utilising a form of language in order to enact forms of care that shape emotional communities and provide a distinctive rhetoric of caregiving, as it were, that makes them effective over the longer term as a literary publication. Emily, I'm wondering if you want to talk about some of the work you've done on letters and the circulation of print material with those letters in the early SPG stuff.
Yeah, so in some of our earlier research, looking at broadly the broad history of bibliotherapy, we were looking at the importance of letters between SPG missionaries in the American colonies and the Society's headquarters in London, and also the importance of the circulation of books between the two. Quite often you find SPG missionaries writing to the Society to request essentially support and reinforcement and advice, but also request particular books as well, and those things go very much hand in hand. Often you'll get replies from the Society saying, here are the books that you requested, and I hope that they will support you in your mission work. So often the printed book and the manuscript letter, often sent in the same packages, for example, in the same shipments across the Atlantic, and seem to have functioned in similar ways to provide these forms of remote caregiving to missionaries that would otherwise be quite distant from their support networks as well. So there's a strong interaction between print and manuscript in those means of providing care.
Thank you very much once more. I do not see any further questions, but we do have a little bit more time if people want to ask a couple more questions or just one more question. Please feel free to do so. And in the meantime, if I may, I was just perhaps going a little bit away from that subject of the textuality of the letters. But you mentioned early on in the talk, I think, emotional communities and imagined communities. And I thought it would be perhaps really interesting if you could say a few words about those. What type of hints and traces do you follow to try and map out those communities? What are the elements that help you to see, or perhaps to guess that a certain group or an emotional community is being formed, and how?
I think perhaps it sort of leads on quite nicely from the previous question in terms of shared liturgy. It is one way that we've been looking at these communities. Something that the SPG does is it ensures that its new missionaries and its parishes have access to standardised texts. So they have access to the Book of Common Prayer, for example. They have access to the key printed documents of the Society. So having those individuals who are separated by thousands of miles, but reading the same material, having access to the same printed texts, I think that's one way that we've been looking at the shared creation of communities. I'll hand over to Alison.
Just to say too, I think it's in terms of what they define themselves against. So one of the fascinating things about SPG missionaries and the early congregations in North America is that sometimes they're not the established church in those colonies, and they're often competing with what would be known as dissenting congregations in Britain for attendance and for material support and for various forms of engagement and political clout, as it were. And so it's been fascinating as someone who has worked primarily on nonconformist and dissenting communities, for me, starting to work on early Anglican communities, but in not in the centre, as it were, but on the peripheries, and seeing how those congregations are trying to formulate their identities, both through letter writing back to the Society's headquarters in London, but also in terms of asking for particular kinds of material to compete with the non-Anglican groups that are around them in the colonies has been fascinating. So it's also we're not them, and we're not doing it in that way. And it's seeing the reformulation of identity by some of these Anglican missionaries who are suddenly not in a dominant and established position, but in a fragile space, exposed to all sorts of potential upheaval, and having to deal with lay members of their congregation who are used to a lot more power and agency in the negotiation, and without the political clout, as it were, of the government to necessarily come behind them. We're just talking, the first 20 years. The formation of identity or community is very much what they're not, as well as what they are in that sense. I think probably the most detailed work we've done in terms of emotional community and language has been with Rutherford's correspondence. Emily in particular has been focusing. Do you just want to say what you've been doing with the letters, Emily, in terms of extracting a language of pastoral care?
Yeah, so again, this is with the printed edition of the Rutherford Letters. As mentioned, we haven't been able to have our archival trips to Scotland, but I've been going through the Rutherford Letters and extracting the particular instances of biblical or other imagery which are used to provide care. For example, the metaphors of suffering as being akin to trial by fire or carrying the cross of Christ. If anyone's familiar with the letters of Rutherford, these metaphors and this imagery is sort of interlaced throughout his letters and is a way of providing comfort to his recipients. So we've been extracting this imagery and also doing a little bit of quantitative analysis to determine what are the images that Rutherford relies on most frequently, what percentage of letters reference carrying the cross of Christ, for example, what sort of problems does Rutherford respond to using specific images. So it's sort of a joint kind of quantitative, qualitative analysis of the specific imagery that Rutherford uses, which I think has helped frame how we are thinking of pastoral care and languages of pastoral care more generally.
Thank you very much, Emily and Alison, for all these fascinating elements. And again, I know I've said it before, but there are so many different elements: early modern, textuality, pastoral care, minorities, dissent. When is dissent? In the end, sometimes the majority, if you displace those same paradigms. And of course, how all of this can relate to present or rather recent crises as well today. So this is an absolutely fascinating project, and we are so glad, I'm quite sure Anne will agree, so glad that we invited you to present the project for our Lib Religion group today. If we don't have any more questions, I think we could perhaps wrap up. And again, I would like to thank all the participants very sincerely. Thank you for joining us today. It is heartwarming to see that we can still congregate despite current difficulties. Those Zoom meetings are extremely tiring. They can be a source of stress as well. But when they go well, they can also be incredibly stimulating. So thank you to all of you for making the time to join us, Anne, Emily, Alison and myself across both sides of the channel. Thank you again, and goodbye for now. Thank you.